In Oklahoma, the wind doesn't just blow, it chases you. Most people here build houses with right angles and wide eaves, but former soldier William Wynn was different. After years of service in the Army Corps of Engineers, he knew that sharp angles were the Achilles heel of any structure against the wind. So he did something the whole town considered crazy. He built a perfectly round house, a concrete dome with no sharp edges for the wind to cling to. Neighbors drove by, laughing at his inverted bowl, calling it the most expensive pigeon coop in the valley. But William didn't care. He and Smoky spent months spraying layers of high-strength concrete and reinforcing it with specialized wire mesh. For William, beauty wasn't in shape, but in existence. He was building a fortress that would make even the strongest winds slide past like water off A. Ducks back. The Oklahoma sky had its own warning. It turned a deep, dark green, a deadly hue only those who had experienced tornadoes could understand. William Wynn felt the pressure shift in his ears before the siren blared. He didn't panic. He'd been preparing for this moment since laying the first brick. William whistled for Smoky, a sharp, decisive sound. They stepped inside their perfect circle. As he closed the 10-centimeter thick steel door, the sounds of the outside world vanished, replaced by an eerie silence. Outside, neighbors were scrambling down their flimsy wooden basements. William sat down in a chair, his hand on Smoky's head, feeling the ground vibrate. The F-5 monster was coming, and it didn't just want to destroy. It wanted to obliterate everything in its path. But William's dome wasn't a target. It was an impenetrable barrier to the wind. When the F-5 tornado swept through, it was dubbed God's finger for its sheer destructive power. Neighbors' wooden houses exploded like matchboxes under the immense pressure. But when the monster struck William's roundhouse, a miracle occurred. Instead of being torn apart, the furious 300-mile-per-hour winds glided around the curved surface of the dome. The wind pressure was evenly distributed, with no point of support for lift to lift the structure. Inside, William and Smoky heard a terrifying roar, like a freight train hurtling overhead. Debris, cars, trees, pieces of the neighbor's house, crashed against the concrete shell but only produced dry clinks. The house didn't budge. The sudden drop in pressure after the eye of the storm could have burst a normal person's lungs. But William's pressure equalization valve system worked perfectly. They were in the eye of the storm, the only place where life could survive amidst a valley being crushed into flat land. The roar of the F-5 didn't fade. It simply stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt physical. William Wynn waited, his hand still resting on Smoky's trembling back. He knew the danger wasn't over. The pressure inside the dome stabilized with final hiss of the intake valves. When William finally unlatched the steel door, the world he knew was gone. The Oklahoma sun fought through a haze of dust to reveal a landscape of splinters. The luxury mansions of his neighbors had been ground into the red dirt, replaced by a jagged mosaic of ruined lives. But the perfect circle stood unblemished, its white concrete shell scarred only by the impact of flying debris. William stepped out onto the concrete pad, Smoky at his side. He didn't feel triumph. He felt the weight of duty. He grabbed his tactical search kit from the wall. The people would laugh at his alien dish, were now buried somewhere under the wreckage of their own pride. And William was the only man with the tools to find them. William's circular home was designed for more than just a fence. It was a tactical hub. Inside the dome, he had installed a seismic sensor array, originally meant to detect shifting ground, but now it was a lifeline. He returned to the control panel, tracking the faint vibrations of survivors tapping on pipes from the shelters below their ruined homes. "Northeast 300 yards, he muttered to Smoky. The dog understood the mission. In the field, Smoky became a living extension of William's radar. They reached the Henderson property, or what was left of it. The family was trapped in a concrete storm cellar, but the exit was blocked by 2 tons of oak tree and the remains of a kitchen island. William didn't use a shovel. He used a winch on his modified tactical truck, which had been parked safely inside the dome's reinforced garage. As the steel cable tightened, pulling the debris away, the first face to emerge in the darkness was the man who had called William's house a giant bowling ball. He didn't laugh this time. He only reached for William's hand with a grip born of pure desperation. The storm had passed, but the trauma was just beginning. The local hospital was miles away, and the roads were choked with telephone poles and twisted metal. William knew his perfect circle had to become more than a home. He opened the secondary airlock. Inside, the dome was climate-controlled, sterile, and powered by an independent battery array. He transformed the living area into a field infirmary. The curved walls, which neighbors once joked made the house look like a spaceship, now provided a sense of infinite, protective space. William used his military medical training to stabilize the injured, while Smoky sat by the children, his steady presence more effective than any sedative. The air inside was clean, filtered through an NBC system that ignored the dust and death outside. As the first rescue helicopters finally appeared on the horizon, the pilots saw a strange sight. A single, white circular beacon in a sea of brown ruin, surrounded by survivors who had found their only sanctuary in the madness of a veteran and his dog. Weeks passed, and the mud of Oklahoma began to dry, but a new kind of storm was brewing. As the federal aid stalled, corporate developers arrived in shiny black SUVs, looking at the devastation not as a tragedy, but as a real estate opportunity. They began offering pennies on the dollar to the desperate families whose homes had been erased. William would watch from the porch of his perfect circle, his moss-green eyes narrowing as he saw the vultures circling. The developers wanted the entire ridge, and William's indestructible dome was the only thing standing in their way. They called it an eyesore and a violation of zoning codes, trying to use legal loopholes to condemn the very structure that had saved 30 lives. But William wasn't just a builder. He was a combat engineer who knew how to dig in. He didn't sign their papers. He sharpened his resolve. Smoky stood by the perimeter fence, a low, vibrating growl serving as a warning to any suit who dared to step onto the red dirt of the wind farm. The developers tried to sue, claiming the dome was a public safety hazard. They brought in high-priced architects to testify that the lack of traditional rafters made the building unstable. But William Wynn was prepared for their theater. He invited the local judge and the town council to the dome for a demonstration. Using a massive industrial wind machine, the kind used for testing aircraft, he blasted the dome with 200-mile-per-hour forced air. while the traditional wooden mock-up the developers had built nearby shattered into splinters within seconds. William stood inside his dome, drinking a cup of coffee. The sound was a whisper. The vibration was zero. The perfect circle didn't fight the wind. It invited the wind to pass by. Smoky sat by his side, unbothered by the artificial gale screaming outside the thick concrete. By the end of the hour, the judge didn't see an eyesore. He saw the future of Oklahoma. William had proven that his madness was the only thing that could truly protect the people of the plains. With the legal battle won, the developers resorted to more desperate measures. They knew William Wynn was the heart of the community's resistance. If he fell, the rest of the valley would sell. One night, a series of mysterious fires began to break out in the temporary shelters of the survivors. It was a calculated move to force the people to leave. William Wynn realized that his perfect circle was no longer just a shelter. It had to become a fortress. He activated the dome's external surveillance and drone perimeter, tools he had kept hidden until now. Smoky, sensing the intruders long before the cameras did, alerted William with a sharp, tactical bark. Two men were creeping toward the dome's power array with canisters of gasoline. William didn't call the police. They were too far away. He stepped out into the moonlight, his muscular frame silhouetted against the white concrete. "You're on the wrong ridge," he said, his voice as cold as a winter frost. Before they could react, Smoky launched into the dark, a blackened and blurred justice. The fire and the fury of the developers couldn't crack the spirit of the ridge. After the failed sabotage, the community's eyes were opened. They didn't want to rebuild the fragile wooden past. They wanted the perfect circle future. William would open his doors once more, but this time not for emergency shelter, but for education. He transformed the interior of his dome into a drafting room. The curved walls became a canvas for blueprints, circular homes designed for every family in the valley. William didn't charge a dime. He provided the engineering, the material lists, and the tactical discipline. He taught the fathers how to spray shotcrete, and the mothers how to reinforce the steel lattices. Smoky was the mascot of the reconstruction, carrying tool belts and providing a calming presence for the children playing among the new circular foundations. The valley was no longer a collection of vulnerable boxes. It was becoming a network of domes, a unified fortress that the sky could never again dismantle. The corporate giants made one last desperate move. They filed an emergency injunction to halt all unconventional construction in the valley, backed by a fleet of bulldozers sent to clear the hazardous debris. They arrived at dawn, the heavy yellow machines idling at the base of the ridge. But when the lead bulldozer reached the perimeter, it didn't find a protest. It found a wall of steel and a veteran who had had enough. William Wynn stood in the middle of the road, his tactical vest buckled tight, Smoky sitting like a gargoyle at his side. Behind him, 30 neighbors stood in a perfect semicircle, each holding a fragment of the ruins the developers had tried to exploit. William didn't say a word. He simply held up a digital recorder. It contained the audio of the developers' hired saboteurs confessing to the arson attempt. The lead suit in the SUV realized the game was over. The perfect circle wasn't just a house anymore. It was a movement. The bulldozers retreated, their engines groaning in defeat. As the sun rose over a ridge that was no longer for sale, 1 year later, the valley looks like nowhere else on earth. It is a garden of white domes, a perfect circle settlement that has become a world-renowned model for disaster resilience. William Wynn still lives in the original dome, but the madman label has been replaced by a title of deep honor, the architect of the ridge. He sits on his porch every evening, the wind whistling softly across the smooth concrete, a sound of peace, not of terror. Smoky is older now, with a bit more silver on his muzzle, but he still patrols the perimeter of the sanctuary they built together. They prove that the storm isn't something to fear if you respect the laws of the universe. The ridge survived because one man chose to build without corners, and in doing so, he created a space where a broken community could finally find its center. As the Oklahoma sun sets over the domes, William Wynn and his dog stand as the eternal guardians of the circle, unbroken, unbowed, and ready for whatever the sky brings next. 1 year later, the valley looks like nowhere else on earth. It is a garden of white domes, a perfect circle settlement that has become a world-renowned model for disaster resilience. William Wynn still lives in the original dome, but the madman label has been replaced by a title of deep honor, the architect of the ridge. He sits on his porch every evening, the wind whistling softly across the smooth concrete, a sound of peace, not of terror. Smoky is older now, with a bit more silver on his muzzle, but he still patrols the perimeter of the sanctuary they built together. They prove that the storm isn't something to fear if you respect the laws of the universe. The ridge survived because one man chose to build without corners, and in doing so, he created a space where a broken community could finally find its center. As the Oklahoma sun sets over the domes, William Wynn and his dog stand as the eternal guardians of the circle, unbroken, unbowed, and ready for whatever the sky brings next. The earthquake was an act of God, but what followed was an act of man. The corporate vultures, having lost a legal battle, had moved into the shadows. They realized that if they couldn't destroy the domes from the outside, they would attack the infrastructure. Under the cover of the post-quake chaos, a team of professional saboteurs targeted the valley's main water filtration plant, the lifeline for the new settlement. William Wynn, monitoring the system from his command center, noticed a sudden drop in pressure and a spike in chemical contaminants. He didn't call the sheriff. He knew the response would be too slow. He donned his tactical night vision gear, checked his suppressed rifle, and whistled for Smoky. This wasn't about aerodynamics anymore. It was about domestic defense. The perfect circle had become a beacon of independence, and William Wynn was going to ensure that the light never went out, no matter who tried to cut the wires. The attempted sabotage was the final straw. The people of the ridge, led by William Wynn, realized that their survival depended on total self-sufficiency. They weren't just a neighborhood anymore. They were a sovereign entity. William began the construction of the Great Shield, a series of reinforced Quonset-style perimeter, walls and solar-powered sensors that connected all the domes into one defensive grid. The perfect circle was now the brain of a fortress Thung Lung. Every neighbor took turns on the watch, trained by William in the basics of perimeter security. Smoky became the leader of AK-9 Patrol Unit, training the other dogs in the valley to recognize the scent of intruders. The corporate SUVs stopped coming. The lawsuits were dropped. The world realized that Bitterroot Ridge wasn't a place you could buy or break. It was a testament to one man's vision, that a house without corners creates a spirit without limits. William stood on his porch, Smoky at his side, looking at a valley that had finally achieved the ultimate form of peace, the peace of prepared. Word of a miracle on the ridge spread far beyond the borders of Oklahoma. As neighboring counties struggled with the slow pace of federal reconstruction, a desperate stream of refugees began to arrive at the base of Williams Hill. They didn't bring lawsuits or blueprints. They brought their children and the clothes on their backs. William Wynn stood at the perimeter gate, looking at the line of weary faces. He knew the ridge couldn't support everyone, but he also knew a soldier's first duty is to protect the vulnerable. He authorized construction of the Arcadia sector, a temporary camp of semicircular reinforced, shelters built from the same materials as his dome. Smoky, sensing the shift from defense to hospitality, spent his days guiding the newcomers through the intake process. The perfect circle was no longer just a house or a fortress. It was becoming a city-state, a sanctuary of stone and steel for those the storm had left behind. The ridge's survival hadn't just caught the eyes of the poor. It had piqued the interest of the powerful. A black helicopter, unmarked and silent, landed on the ridge's helipad. Men in tactical suits, led by an official from a shadow agency, presented William with a classified offer. They wanted a proprietary shotcrete formula, the specific mixture of basalt fibers and volcanic ash that allowed his dome to survive a direct EF5 hit. They spoke of national security and military applications, but William saw through the jargon. They wanted to weaponize his sanctuary. My formula was built to keep families alive, not to bunker missiles, William said, his voice a low growl that matched Smoky's. The standoff was silent but intense. William realized that his perfect circle was now a target for a different kind of vulture, one that wore a badge and carried a briefcase. He knew that if he refused, the accidents would begin again, but this time, the enemy had a budget. The refusal came with a price. Within 48 hours, the ridge was under a different kind of siege. Not bulldozers or lawsuits, but swarms of surveillance drones. They hovered at the edges of the perimeter, recording every structural detail and monitoring every movement. The people of Arcadia's sector were terrified, but William Wynn was in his element. He activated the domes, Iron Veil, a signal jamming array he designed to protect his private communications. One by one, the intruding drones began to fall from the sky like dead birds. William and Smoky spent the night patrolling the ridge, collecting the fallen machines. He wasn't just defending his home. He was collecting intelligence on who was attacking him. He realized the agency was trying to reverse engineer the dome's weak points. He gathered the community in the central dome. The sky isn't our friend anymore, he told them. But as long as we stay in the circle, they can't touch us. The shadow agency decided that if they couldn't watch from above, they would take it from the ground, under the cover of a massive thunderstorm that knocked out the regional power grid. A Black Ops team moved toward the ridge. They utilized high-tech thermal dampeners to stay invisible to William sensors. But technology cannot fool the nose of a K9 warrior. Smoky, sleeping at the foot of William's bed, didn't growl. He simply stood up, his body vibrating with a silent warning. William Wynn was awake before the first boot touched his gravel. He didn't turn on the lights. He reached for his tactical headset. The dome was in blackout mode. The thick concrete walls, which had survived the tornado, were now a silent maze for the intruders. As the first operative breached the side airlock, he didn't find a helpless veteran. He found the ghost of the ridge and 30 kilograms of black and 10 fury, waiting in the dark. William didn't hand the intruders over to the local police. He knew they were on the payroll. Instead, he sat them in the center of the circular room, the perfect circle, and let the architecture do the interrogation. In a space with no corners, there is nowhere for a lie to hide. He activated the dome's high-frequency acoustic emitters, creating a soundscape that made it impossible for the intruders to maintain their mental barriers. "Who sent you?" William asked, his voice echoing perfectly from every direction. The lead operative, disoriented by the curved geometry and the relentless gaze of the veteran and his dog, finally broke. He revealed the agency's plan to seize the ridge by declaring it a national defense area. William recorded everything. He wasn't just defending his home anymore. He was gathering the ammunition to destroy the agency's legal standing once and for all. William knew that a direct fight with the agency was a losing battle, so he chose a different weapon. The truth, using the satellite link he'd fortified during the drone siege. He broadcast the operative's confessions directly to every major news network and social media platform simultaneously. The miracle on the ridge was no longer a local story. It was a national scandal. He showed the world the drones, the arson evidence, and the National Defense Area documents. By sunrise, the ridge was surrounded not by Black Ops teams, but by news helicopters and thousands of supporters. The shadow agency was forced to retreat into the darkness. The perfect circle had become a fortress of transparency. William stood on his porch, Smoky at his side, as a sea of people cheered at the perimeter gate. He had turned his sanctuary into a symbol of freedom that no agency could ever condemn. The national scandal turned William Wynn into an icon of resilience. But William didn't want fame. He wanted to ensure that no storm, natural or man-made, could ever break a community again. He transformed the ridge into the Wynn Institute of Monolithic Design. Architects and engineers from around the globe flocked to Oklahoma to learn the secrets of the basalt fiber concrete and the cornerless geometry. William, with Smoky always at his heel, walked the construction sites like a master sergeant of the future. He didn't just teach them how to build with concrete. He taught them about the aerodynamics of life, how to let the pressures of the world slide past you instead of letting them tear you down. The original White Dome was now surrounded by classrooms, laboratories, and workshops, all built in the same circular perfection. The ridge was no longer just a home. It was the birthplace of a new civilization that refused to be fragile. But Oklahoma's weather is a vengeful spirit. After the flood and the frost came the great heat. A record-breaking drought turned the plains into a tinderbox. By mid-August, a lightning strike ignited the red dirt fire, a wall of flame that moved faster than any rescue crew could manage. As the fire roared toward the ridge, the wooden fences and remaining traditional barns in the valley turned into fuel. William Wynn watched the orange glow on the horizon from his command center. He knew that while his concrete was fireproof, the air intake systems were a vulnerability. He ordered a hard seal on all the domes. They didn't just have to survive the wind. They now had to survive the heat of a furnace. He and Smoky donned their fire-resistant tactical gear, patrolling the perimeter to activate the external misting systems. The ridge was about to become an island of white stone in a sea of fire. When the fire finally passed, the ridge was a black scar on the earth, except for the domes. They stood like bleached bones in the ash, untouched by the flames that had melted the metal siding of traditional buildings. William Wynn stepped out onto the scorched ground, the heat still radiating from the red clay. Smoky followed, his paws protected by tactical heat boots. The perfect circle had survived the tornado, the earthquake, the agency, and now the fire. People began to emerge from the domes, coughing but alive. William realized that his work was no longer about survival. It was about rebirth. He used the Institute's resources to begin Project Phoenix, planting fire-resistant vegetation and rebuilding the valley with a new understanding of the climate's extremes. The madman was now the savior of the scorched earth. He and Smoky stood on the peak, looking at the Black Valley, already planning where the next circle would be drawn. 5 years have passed since the red dirt fire. The black ash has been replaced by a lush, fire-resistant ecosystem of buffalo grass and silver sage. Bitterroot Ridge is no longer just a settlement. It is the hub of the global Circle Network. Satellite images show clusters of white domes appearing in disaster-prone zones from the coast of Japan to the mountains of Chile. William Wynn, now 60, spends his days in the Central Dome, which has evolved into a global monitoring station. He and Smoky, older, slower, but still the soul of the ridge, watch as real-time data flows in from thousands of perfect circles worldwide. Every time a storm hits or a tremor strikes, a green light blinks on William's map, indicating another family saved by the geometry of the circle. The veteran has retired his rifle and his welding torch. He is now the silent conductor of a world that has finally learned how to stand its ground. Time is the one storm that no architecture can deflect. In the quiet of a late autumn evening, Smoky, the warrior who had survived the Ye-5, the fire, and the Shadow Agency, let out one final, soft sigh. He passed away peacefully at the foot of William's bed. In the very center of the dome, they had built together. The entire ridge fell silent. There were no sirens, only the sound of the wind brushing against the concrete. William Wynn didn't mourn in the traditional way. He honored his partner with the dignity of a soldier. He buried Smoky at the highest point of the ridge, marking the spot with a simple, circular granite stone. On it was engraved a single word, Sentinel. As William stood over the grave, the moss-green eyes that stared down monsters finally clouded with tears. He wasn't just losing a dog. He was losing the witness to his life's mission. William Wynn lived to see the ridge become more than a settlement. It became a legend. On his 80th birthday, he sat on the same porch where the neighbors had once laughed at his birdhouse. Looking out, he saw 1,000 white circles dotting the landscape, A civilization born from the courage to be different. He knew his time was near. He looked at the new generation of engineers walking the ridge, children who had never known the fear of a collapsing roof. He walked to the sentinel stone, whispered a final good boy to the wind, and returned his dome. As the sun set for the final time on the architect of the ridge, the perfect circle glowed with an ethereal light. William Wynne had proven that the world may break us, but if we build our lives without corners, the wind has nothing to catch, and the soul has everything to keep. The veteran and his dog were gone, but the circle was unbroken. April returned to the Bitterroot Ridge not with flowers, but with the whispers of the great thaw. The 10-foot snowdrifts that once threatened to crush the valley were now transforming into a gray, sluggish ocean of mud. William Wynne stood on the peak, Smoky at his side, watching the landscape reshape itself. The modern shells of the luxury estates had been stripped bare by the blizzard, leaving behind only rotting timber skeletons and walls that crumbled under the weight of the water. But amidst the ruin, William's steel-reinforced domes, partially buried for geothermal stability, emerged like islands of unyielding life. However, the thaw brought a new challenge: geological instability. Stress cracks began to slice through the saturated mud like razor cuts. William, the veteran engineer, knew exactly what those cracks meant. "The mountain is moving," he whispered to Smoky. The dog let out a sharp, warning bark, his amber eyes fixed on the main supply road that was already beginning to subside into the valley. As the thaw accelerated, the dead man's curve, the only lifeline for food and medical supplies, was being swallowed by the groaning mountain. The saturated clay was sliding, threatening to cut Bitterroot off from the world forever. William Wynne knew that if the road fell, the valley would starve. He returned to his dome's command post, unearthing the last crates of industrial explosives, tools he had prepared not for destruction, but for desperate engineering. He and Smoky had entered the hot zone to trigger a controlled blast at the granite dam upstream, diverting the floodwater away from the weakened roadbed. It was a tactical suicide mission. William donned his rucksack, whistled for Smoky, and stepped out into the slurry. His perfect circle was empty now, its interior sacrificed to the needs of the community. But William Wynne knew that the mission of a combat engineer is never truly finished until the path is clear. The storm of the century has passed. The mud has hardened into stone, and Bitterroot has been reborn. 1 year later, William Wynne sits on the porch of the central dome, a hot mug of coffee in his hand, looking down at a valley that no longer fears the sky. The glass palaces are gone, replaced by a community of steel and concrete circles, built to survive, not to display. His perfect circle is no longer a secret. It is the heart of 1,000 new homes. William holds no official title, for he needs none. He is the architect of the ridge, the man who stayed when the world turned to ice and mud. Every summer, the sound of drills and hammers echoes. But it is no longer the sound of madness. It is the sound of the people who have learned the hardest lesson of the plains. William stands up, Smoky, older now, muzzle silvered, stepping in sync with him. They watch the sunset paint Bitterroot in shades of fire and gold. William Wynne and Smoky have earned their peace, not by avoiding the storm, but by becoming the anchor that the storm could never move.